My name is Luke Eastwood. I'm a Druid. I talk to you about Post-Romantic Druidism. So, what? Okay, looks like I'm back again. Seem to be a bit of trouble with the internet. So hopefully you can at least hear me if you can't see me. Anyway, as I was saying, yeah, the Druidism in the follow-on to the post-romantic era after the sort of Romantic revival is what I'm talk about. But first of all, I need to take a quick look at just a very, very quick recap about the revival. This sort of happened really in the century, the early 1700s. Associated with this is John Aubrey, who was born in 1626. He was sort of an antiquarian, a bit of a and then you've got other people as well involved, such as from Donegal actually, and he left Ireland as a very young man because, as a Catholic, he wasn't allowed to go to be schooled. Really, he had to leave. He went to Glasgow and converted to Protestantism beforehand in order to be able to go and be educated, because obviously he was a bright guy, and that was the only way he could go to university. Really, was to convert. Anyway, he would have grown up sort of shortly after the collapse of the Gaelic sort of order in Ireland. So yeah, he became quite famous in the Netherlands and Germany and Britain for his philosophy, and he also wrote a book about history for Druids, which disappeared for a while, was republished in the 1800s. Another guy is William Stukeley, again quite a maverick, sort of an early archaeologist, an antiquarian. And another famous guy from Wales is the forger Edward Williams, who was also a drug addict, a laudanum addict, and spent a lot of time in debtor's prison. He's responsible for a book called Bardas, written under the name Iolo Morganwg, and that forms a lot of the basis of modern Druidry. For instance, the Druid's prayer comes from that. That book has a lot of different versions of the same prayer, the same stories, the same accounts. Much of it is probably made up by him, but still it has made its way into modern Druidism. It's hard to tell what is fake and what's genuine from a lot of his work. So anyway, these are the main characters of the revival movement, and you've got sort of various influences on the revival. I suppose Roman accounts quite a lot, not so much the Greeks. There's sort of the Welsh, Romano-British Druidism. Known about that. Certainly the Arthurian legends played a part in the revival. A large element of fantasy and supposition, or what people just had lots of business that era, you know, linking to. There was even at one time a bunch of people who, I think they called them Israelites from Britain, came over to Tara and dug up huge sections of it looking for the Ark of the Covenant, and lots of really bizarre ideas. And then later on in the revival, you've got the beginnings of proper translations from Irish and Welsh into English and other languages. And there's also a link with Freemasonry. I think it was William Stukeley was a Freemason, and he sort of introduced the idea of Druidry into the Masonic movement. So, and then towards the very end of that period, you've got the Celtic Twilight, people like W.B. Yeats, Lady Gregory, and they did a lot of publicizing of Irish myth. Although, unfortunately, certainly in the case of Lady Gregory, it was sort of sanitized to some extent. The rude bits were very much left out, you know, sort of Victorian morals sort of coming to play there. And then sort of into the 20th century, you're starting to see some scholars like Robert Graves having a big influence on the current Druidism. Although he was actually a Greek scholar, he wasn't a Celtic scholar, unlike his, I think his father and grandfather were, and they were very critical of him and his book, The White Goddess, which has had a huge influence on modern neo-paganism, which was published in 1948. The Celtic tree calendar comes from his ideas, although there's no actual historical basis for this whatsoever. It's, you know, he made some serious mistakes. His idea that there were 13 consonants in the Yom alphabet, which he got from an old book called Ogygia, was completely incorrect. There's actually 15. So that blew away his 13 consonants, 13 months idea. There's no real correspondence there. But, you know, it's a nice idea, though. The idea of a Celtic tree calendar linked to the moon cycles is, you know, a very pleasing idea, and perhaps has some value in itself, even if it isn't genuinely old. And then you've got throughout the Romantic period, really mostly from the late 1700s onwards, the beginnings of translations, a lot coming into the end of the 1800s. Kuno Mayer, Whiteley Stokes, Eugene O'Curry, R.A.S. McAllister, various others, which are the basis of a lot of the Reconstructionist movement, which for people who don't speak, you know, old or middle Irish or even modern Irish, and the same with Welsh, it gives people an opportunity to actually read and understand the old texts, which are referring to Druidism, or, you know, part of the mythological canon, if you like. So that brings us sort of, that's a kind of very, very lightning fast recap on this this revival period, which you're talking quite a long period of time. We'd say up to about 1950, going back to 1700 odd. So that you know, that's a pretty significant amount of time, 250 odd years we're talking about. So the modern era, we start to see some real changes. You've got, prior to that, these sort of Masonic influenced orders to a very large extent, like the ancient Druid order, which has very strong Masonic links, and that claims to be descended back to the circle of universal bond, I think it's called, or the most ancient Druid order, which is supposedly began in 1717 with John Toland being the first chosen chief, followed by William Stukely, and among the people who've been credited as William Blake, although that's difficult to actually corroborate that. Some people, such as Ronald Hutton, think that the whole kind of early history of the Druid revival is just fake, that none of it's real. But although it may not be documented, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all untrue. A lot of it was oral, it wasn't written down. And just because things aren't written down doesn't mean they didn't happen. So I'll leave you to decide whether Ronald Hutton is correct, or if other sources that claim this sort of history are correct. It's really open to interpretation to a very large extent. So you begin to see a shift with the beginnings of Obod, which is the Order of Bards of Eights and Druids, which I'm a member of myself. Ross Nichols left the order he was in, the Ancient Druid Order, and he was moving towards a more Celtic influence rather than a Masonic influence, which is generally regarded as a good thing in today's circles. So that was in 1964. He was the leader. He died, and then there was a hiatus, and Philip Cargon became the new leader in 1988. And he in turn handed over the reins to the current leader, who is Emma Burke, who is an Irish woman. And that sort of brings us up to date. That was in 2020 that she became the new chosen chief of Obod. So there's been 3 leaders so far of this organization. So what you see with Obod, although it is what you call, has made a definite attempt to return to the original sources, to the source material, to the Celtic texts, etc., which you find a lot of the revival Druidry is only very, very loosely attached to much of that knowledge. You'll have to excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, so I'll do my best to keep going and not growl too much. Anyway, another organization of note was started by a man called Isaac Bonowitz, the ADF, or Andrecht Fane, which means a druid or magical fellowship. The word Drecht means both druidry and magic. It's a general term for magic in the Irish language, Drecht. So anyway, there's been a bit of scandal surrounding him in the last few years. In 2010 he died, but about 8 years later several people came forward accusing him of abuse. So he's been denounced by the ADF, obviously because of quite significant evidence that he wasn't the person that he appeared to be. He was an abusive person and mistreated people. So given the principles of Druidry are supposed to be very much about truth, and good moral behavior would be a part of that. To have a leader who's discrediting themselves like that is pretty scandalous. So they've moved on from that. The AD ties with Isaac Bonowitz. It's a neo-pagan organization. It has both Norse and Irish some magic within it, although I think, if I'm right, you're generally encouraged not to mix the two too much together. And then that brings me on to the kind of divide, I suppose, in modern Druidry, which is between the Reconstructionists and the Revivalists, or Romanticists, some people refer to them as. So basically, what this boils down to is, if you want to sort of polarize it very much, it's Druidry. So based on purely on ancient sources and what can be proven about the Druids, versus a more sort of fantastical, romantic approach, and one that is often what you call syncretic, where you get different influences from two or more different parts and blend them together. To the purists, that's anathema. You know, for instance, there would be a lot of Hermetic tradition which has crept into modern Druidism, and you know, the real kind of purists would reject that completely, claiming that the ancient Celts were non-Hermetic. They had their own unique form of religion and beliefs that are not linked to you know, Neo-Platonic elements and the classical world and all the Hermetic beliefs that come from ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, because there is evidence to suggest there are ties between the ancient Greeks, certainly, and the Celts, at least certainly in Gaul, that's the case. And there's, yeah, well, that you could go on at great length about that, which I'm not going to do. That's another talk entirely. So, and along with this sort of puritanical view is a sort of rejection of sort of New Ageism. You know, get loads of stuff into a pot, mix them all together, and serve it up as some kind of continuous whole, which to those of that opinion, you know, that isn't acceptable. There's a strong belief that the Druidism is not a hodgepodge of different beliefs from all over Europe or all over the world. That it is you know, an entity of itself which has a unique character that shouldn't be blended with others. So you have a kind of a continuum, if you like. You have people right on one side who are saying, right, this is how it is. It's got to be pure and refer only to like the Welsh and Scottish and Irish texts only. And on the other side, you've got people saying, well, look, there's no harm in having a bit of stuff from Taoism or from Hermetic magic, or etc. And then you have people who are sort of somewhere in the middle, where they would feel inclined to sort of try to stick to Celtic sources as much as possible, but they would not be opposed to the idea of blending it with other ideas where they seem relevant and where they don't conflict with established ideas about Celtic Druidism. I suppose the big problem there is the question of conflict, whether these beliefs from other paths go against what's established in Celtic Druidism, or whether they don't conflict. You could ask different people about that, and you get a load of different answers about whether such and such is okay or not. So really, I suppose at the end of the day, really every individual Druid has to make their own choice, really, about whether they want to go down the syncretic path or the purist path, or somewhere in the middle. There is no absolute dogma on this. It's not like, say, for instance, you know, the Catholic Church, where there's a pope who will make dictates, infallible papal bulls about certain subjects, so it's set in stone. There is no authority within the Druid movement to actually do such a thing. You might have the heads of certain orders who will have an opinion about certain matters, but these aren't so much dogma as sort of the sort of localized beliefs and practices of a particular order. And that there are a huge number of orders. Even in somewhere like Britain alone, there's absolutely tons and tons of them. And if you go further across the world, you've got now different orders set up in all over North America, in Australia, throughout Europe, and other countries, some I probably am not even aware of. So there isn't any real authority, really. It comes down to sort of a matter of personal belief and personal choice, really, about how you're going to practice. So I would suggest there is what you might call a middle way, which is neither reconstructionist nor is it romantic. It maybe takes elements from both of these. So this would leave room for experiential knowledge, what some people might refer to as personal gnosis. So your own personal experience you acquire through working with nature, working with gods and goddesses, etc., it would be regarded as something valid. So that would include, in some cases, channeled knowledge. So this is quite controversial for some people. If it can't be verified, they don't want to know about it. So I think the main point here, channeled and where they have been. So if you're referring to knowledge that comes from ancient texts or modern texts, then it's good to acknowledge that. Where something comes from personal experience or Gnostic work, some kind of channeling, for instance, that needs to be acknowledged too. So people understand what you're talking about, that you've got some kind of frame of reference for your opinion, your views, rather than just saying this is how it is. It's probably sensible to kind of back up what you're saying and distinguish between sort of book knowledge or oral or written sources and stuff that you've just come to accept or know through your own personal experience. But generally speaking, there has been over the last 70 odd years a gradual return to the source material as more and more that has become available. I suppose one of the good things about modern publishing is a lot of the old books that were published during the Celtic Twilight and the Revival period have been made available again because they're non-copyright. So with digital printing, it's possible to print small quantities of certain books. Like you could now buy digital print versions of the Book of the Taking of Ireland, or such things as the Annals of the Four Masters, or the Four Ancient Books of Wales, etc., etc. The triads, they can all be rebought in cheap editions instead of having to go out and spend like £300, £400, £500 or euros on an original text. So it is possible now to acquire translations of these old books for a very reasonable price, or even just download them off the internet. You can download PDF copies or read them as HTML pages on a lot of websites. There's a really particularly useful one called the Corpus Electronic Text Online. I think it's Celt. um, Irish, massive number of Irish and Welsh and Scottish texts, particularly on that website, that you can read for free. Whereas before the internet, it did tend to mean you had to make a trip to a specialist library. I mean, you still have to do that for some books. In my case, I would have to go to the National Library of Ireland to go and use these books, which you're not allowed to photograph. You're not allowed to photocopy them. If you can stay and read them for as long as you like, but if you want to copy any of it, you've got to literally get a notebook and write it out by hand, which does make life quite difficult if you're looking to do your own research into Druidism. But as I said, the vast majority of major texts are now available for free online, or you can get really cheap facsimiles from online sellers, or even in some bookshops. So that does make life a lot easier and has facilitated a return to the source material, which was very, very difficult, say, prior to like 2000. Getting hold of these books was quite difficult, in fact. And certainly if you go back into the Romantic period, only people who were really, really very wealthy could actually get copies of these books and build up a kind of a decent library for themselves. So that's a really positive thing about how things have changed, and that you don't have to be rich to be a druid anymore and learn all about Irish or Welsh or Scottish texts, or even like sort of the Roman and Greek accounts. They can be obtained as well pretty cheaply, whereas this wouldn't have been the case in the past at all. It would have cost vast fortunes to accumulate a kind of decent library on Druidism. And so I think that is a really, really positive development and gives a much more level playing field to people who are interested in Druidism. That you don't have to have loads of money anymore, which is a fantastic thing. So anyway, there's also, of course, been archaeological developments in the last while. A particularly interesting one for me was the site of Cloctor in County Meath, which is today known as the Hill of Ward, which is the oldest known documented site in relation to Halloween, or Samhain as it's called here. And of course, there's a re-examination of many sites all over. I can't remember when it was. They discovered Woodhenge in close to Stonehenge, and then explorations have been made over the avenue that's sort of running between Avebury and Stonehenge, and kind of all kinds of sites have been found all over Europe, particularly sort of in France and in Britain and in Ireland, and new stuff is being found all the time. In fact, here on the Dingle Peninsula, where I am at the moment, a barrow was found, which is currently private. It's not open to the public. Maybe one day it will be, once it's been fully excavated and been made safe. That was discovered by a farmer, I think it was a year or two ago, during the lockdown. So there's new stuff coming all of the time, which is very interesting. And it has changed the way that people are looking at some of the mythology, where in some cases it seems to corroborate the mythological accounts, which have often been dismissed as just flights of fantasy and nonsense by many scholars in the past. Whereas we have to wonder if actually these are actually based on real events. A notable example of this would be the idea that Troy was just made up by Homer. The whole events of Troy was just a story. and Troy never existed. But of course, they found Troy in Western Turkey, I think it is, and that does prove that it does actually have some basis in reality. That whole story of the Iliad, and the same is happening with Celtic mythology to some extent, as more and more time passes and more work is done. Another thing that has happened is an acknowledgement of some of the fakery or forgery that's happened in the past. Some of the poems of Macpherson, which are fictitious. The work of Iolo Morganwg, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of that being forged. And then you've also other things. There's a book called, I think it's the 21 Dreams or Lessons of Merlin, which I haven't actually read myself, but that has been largely discredited as nonsense by a great many people. Obviously, I don't know for myself because I haven't actually read it, but so I'd say, well, check it out for yourself if you want, but you may well find that a lot of what's in it is nonsense. Yeah, I'll have to read it myself someday and find out whether that's true or not. But the general trend has been sort of reevaluate a lot of dubious scholarship of the past, a lot of fantastical writings from the revival period, and reassess them in the light of the knowledge that we do have now. And of course, with historical documents being more available, and also the work of many scholars is more available now. You can download academic papers quite easily now, which you wouldn't have been. Any layman who isn't a historian or an archaeologist, you can go and find out an awful lot for yourself, which again is fantastic. The internet is a wonderful thing. It's such an incredible tool. You can just look at pictures of kittens all day, or you can use it as a very serious academic tool if you want. Nothing wrong with looking at kittens, I might add. There's actually a cat in here trying to. So as I'm saying, this middle way, being neither reconstructionist or romantic, it allows for a certain amount of freedom for growth, for personal growth, for growth of collective ideas as well. And as many people in the modern part have suggested, that Druidism should be a living part. It shouldn't be something that's just like a fossil set in stone, that's unchanging, frozen in time, unable to move, unable to adapt. I would think it rather bizarre if the original Druids weren't adaptable. That I would imagine that they may have had some dogma, but I would hope that they would have been open to changing ideas with time. Often you will find that inflexibility can lead to the demise of religions, to demise of entire societies, even because of an inability to adapt or to accept change. So I really think I like the idea of Druidism being a living part. Okay, yeah, we need to be realistic. We need to use those sources, but at the same time, there should be room for some experience. The times that we live in, we can't jump back 2,000 years into a society that has long been gone. That just isn't possible, nor should we necessarily wish to. There are probably what we consider now reprehensible practices that occurred in the past that are best left where they may belong, in the past. So another thing that I've noticed in the last 20 years really is a resurgence of the Irish sources, a lot of revival Druidry, the Welsh sources, whereas what's happened is there's a growing awareness of the incredibly rich amount of resources coming from Ireland. There has been accumulated in Ireland, and yeah, I just opened the door to let the cat out. Well, the camera seemed to have gone off. Yeah, there's a huge amount of sources in Ireland. Some texts that are maybe not specifically Druidic as such, but describe a lot of the Druidic path and some of the ideas which would be in common in pre-Christian Ireland. So again, many of these you can find on the internet. For instance, The Wisdom of Cormac is quite a small volume. You can pick that up for less than €10. That's attributed to Cormac MacArt, who lived around 200 AD. And that's quite an insightful volume. That's just one of many, many Irish sources that are worth looking at. And this is something that's become more and more of interest with time. Ogham is something else that has been of interest since Robert Graves mentioned it. But you'll find that's kind of been reevaluated to quite a large extent. Damien McManus is one guy that's brought that to the fore. Other writers I can think of would be John Paul Patton. He's written a brilliant book about Ogham, and particularly in terms of reevaluating the Ogham list itself would be the work of Niall McCoytier, who speaks Irish, but he also understands Old and Middle Irish, which is kind of vital in terms of accurately interpreting what Ogham is actually about. So his look at that and reevaluating the medieval manuscripts has been really vital, I think. And I'm certainly a big fan of his work, and I'd strongly recommend looking at it if you get the chance. And there is generally a move away, I think, in the modern part from Hermeticism as such. You know, there are differences definitely in Druidry with ceremonial magic from the Hermetic tradition, and what we find in Wicca and other forms of witchcraft, and again Freemasonry. All of those things to have very strong links with Hermetic tradition, and there is a lot to indicate that Druidry, at least in its original form, was quite different and didn't originally adhere to the Neoplatonic elements that we know. You know, the usual earth, air, fire, and water, and spirit or ether in the center. Those concepts were, it seemed, into Druidism from Greece at some point. And the original model would have been one of the threefold model, land and sky. And then you've got 9 elements within the Celtic model instead of in this sort of more what we know as the Hermetic or Neoplatonic elements. So you've got sort of this contact with certainly the later Druids. I'm talking about the period sort of late BC into up to about 400, 500 AD, where you get the interaction with the Greeks and the Romans. A guy called Philip Freeman's written some very interesting books on this. The Philosopher and the Druids in particular, which he talks about Posidonius and earliest sort of contact going back about, well, probably 300 or 400 BC between the Greeks and the Druids. That's something that has been explored again a bit more in recent times. So coming to the end, really, I suppose you want to talk about the future. So I suppose that you will get more divergence between Reconstructionists and Romanticists. They're two ends of Druidism or Druidry, which cannot be reconciled, really. So if you sit, a New Age Druid down with a Reconstructionist, they'll have a hell of a lot to argue about, and believe me, they do. So there are two ends of the spectrum. So people in the middle, maybe this middle part I talked about, maybe there's a lot of hope for that as sort of a slightly different way of looking at it. So I think over time you will get an increase in this centrist position, not at either of these extremes. And I'd say probably over time there will be continued expansion of the neo-Druidic orders. Certainly, if you look at Obod, since it was reinvigorated by Philip Carr-Gomm, it has definitely grown enormously, and is now all over the world, and it will continue to grow, I imagine, under Emma Burke's care. So there will be more exploration, obviously, of forgotten and untranslated texts, because there are still plenty of them left that haven't been worked on. There's a limited number of Celtic scholars in the world, and it does require very specialist knowledge in order to actually do this work. So hopefully translations from Gaeilge and Cymraeg, the Irish and Welsh languages, will continue and hopefully become available to the general public, and hopefully in relatively cheap editions that ordinary people can afford to buy. So I think there is a certain understanding of the renewed importance, because we live in an age now where you can even make fake videos of famous people and fool people. So I think there is a desire for people to know that what they're learning about is actually genuine, that is true, that is based on something substantial, and not just sort of made up by some random person. I can remember, I think quite some time ago, there was a book on Druidism which was claimed to be translated from German, which the original text had been in a Celtic language supposedly. I think that came out in the 90s, and then it turned out this whole thing was a complete and utter fake. I forget the name of the book now, but that kind of thing doesn't happen that much. But really, I think there is, in most cases, people want to know that what they're practicing, what they're learning, has some basis in reality, that it is authentic. And certainly I feel that way. I don't want to be incorporating my path, my own personal practice of Druidism, that are bogus. I'd like to feel that what I'm doing is based on something genuine, and that my personal experience and gnosis I get from that is underpinned by something that's real and genuine and has value. So that's really it. I was sort of forgetting, I should have mentioned about my books at the beginning, but I'll do it now before I come to an end. I've written a couple of books on Druidism, which are published by Moon Books. The first one being this, The Druid's Primer, which came out in 2011. And this one came out in, I think, 2020, The Druid Garden, which is, well, basically focused on nature, working with nature and the environment and agriculture and gardening. So anyway, I hope you found it interesting. Some of the things I mentioned there, you might want to check out some of those authors that I mentioned as well. And yeah, feel free to check out my own work. And yeah, I would say above all, if you're involved in Druidism, try to keep an open mind and keep searching, keep looking for new knowledge, because I think the minute you stop learning, life has become kind of stilted and grey and perhaps rather boring. To have a thirst for knowledge, I think, is a good thing. And I'm still learning, and I hope I still will be till the day I die. Anyway, thank you for listening, and that's it. Thank you very much.